Mr. Chair.
That was fantastic. You're pulling at your phone.
Moana Mackie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm pleased Maggie Berry has woken up and given us her speech on part one of the bill. It's a little bit late because we're actually up to clauses 1 and 2 of the legislation, but I welcome her part one speech nonetheless, and I thank the Chair for his indulgence of allowing her a few hours late granted, to finally give her speech on part one of the bill. Actually had nothing to do with the title and commencement of this particular piece of legislation. And again, you see this extraordinary rewriting of history, because yes, there were submitters who came along and said that they supported the general thrust of the bill, but under questioning, they couldn't actually say that they had any confidence that what the bill was actually putting in place was going to deliver the promised outcomes. And when we put the facts to them, Maggie Berry calls them emotional nonsense, but the rest of us call them facts and evidence. When we put facts and evidence to them and said, do you realise that this is not going to reduce the rates burden? It is going to do nothing except put unreasonable pressure on local government to continue to underinvest in infrastructure after, as Andrew Williams pointed out, the Prime Minister told them that he wanted them to invest more. They had to begrudgingly accept that, yes, they had accepted that that could possibly be the case. I don't think I've actually ever seen groups like Federated Farmers, Business New Zealand, the Employers and Manufacturers Association, I don't think I've ever seen them less enthused about a piece of legislation that they support than they were about this particular bill. They were hardly effusive in their praise for this legislation. They admitted that there were big problems with it and that it may not actually result in any of the promised outcomes that the Honourable Dr Nick Smith had put forward. So I think this Act, it's called the Local Government Act 2002 Amendment Bill. That really doesn't sum up what is in. That's a very innocuous sounding title for a very, very damaging piece of legislation. And maybe instead it should be called the Local Government Act, in brackets, it ain't broke, so I'm going to break it, Amendment Bill, because that's essentially what this bill does. There is no mischief here that needs resolving. There is no problem in local government that can't be fixed under the current legislation. It ain't broke, so Nick Smith is going to break it with this particular piece of legislation. And that's exactly what it's going to do, because it undermines local democracy. That's right, he did it to ACC as well. It undermines local democracy. It's built on a tissue of lies, of figures that were so shoddy that the ministry had to take them down off their website. It was a manufactured crisis, that local government was so indebted and so out of control and carrying out all these bizarre and superfluous activities that Nick Smith had to ride in and clamp down and seize central control in Wellington and say, from now on, you're only going to do what I tell you you can do. That's what we were told by the Honourable Dr Nick Smith. But the reality is, council debt is prudent. There are a few councils that are having issues, like Kaipara is the one that's constantly referred to. Why we're destroying local government right across New Zealand because the current Kaipara council is in financial difficulty is a question that no member opposite has bothered to try and answer. So I wonder, when Nick Smith was putting this legislation together as the former Minister for Local Government, whether he considered just being honest and naming it the Local Government I Hate Local Government Amendment Bill, because essentially that's the message that local government have taken out of this, is that Nick Smith doesn't trust them. They can't make decisions on their own because he doesn't trust that they will make the same decisions that he might have wanted them to make. And when we look at what's happening to local democracy in this legislation, it is particularly concerning, because this bill introduces powers for a minister to defer local government elections under regulation, to just defer them. And we know that this is happening because he wants to push through changes in Wellington that he's been planning for a long time, and he's got a particular view in his head about how a reorganised Wellington local government region would look. And so he wants the power to be able to just say to the voters in Wellington, sorry, you don't get to have a local government election in 2013 when every other council apart from Environment Canterbury around the country gets to have an election, because I want to rush this through so quickly, and your democratic election is just kind of annoying and interfering with my timeframes, so I'm just going to defer it. Well, that's simply not good enough. Local government is not some kind of underling that the minister can just control at his whim. When Labour was in government, we saw local government as a partner, as a very important strategic partner. And that has died under this current national government, and that is a tragedy. And I think when you see every single council unanimously voting against this legislation, saying they do not support it, What Minister of Local Government doesn't take that seriously, Mr Chair? Mr Chair. Yeah. What Minister of Local Government says it's okay to make massive reforms and changes in local government that every single council, 78 of them, every single one of them opposes? Doesn't that raise a red flag that maybe, just maybe, the reforms are wrong? That maybe they are going to do more damage than good? And when you look across the spectrum of local government in New Zealand, these are not people who are aligned politically one way or another consistently. They're not all Labour supporters or National supporters. They're a mix. They represent communities that have very different issues, very different values, very different politics. And yet on this issue, they all came together with one voice and unanimously said, we do not want this legislation. Now, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith referred to them as self-serving and said that local government was nothing more than local government in New Zealand was nothing more than a union. That's what he said about local government in New Zealand. As I said at the time, that's not such an insult for us, but I know for him that's about the highest insult he could possibly hand out. To call the very practitioners who every single day do this at the coalface, who know their local communities, who want to be able to prioritise for themselves what their council's priorities are going to be. They don't want Wellington to tell them what the priorities are going to be. For the Minister of Local Government to ignore that is unbelievably arrogant. Unbelievably arrogant. And why are they doing this? Well, another title for this bill could be the Local Government Act 2002 Look Over There Amendment Bill, because this is a diversion. This is a diversion. So look over there so that you don't see what we're doing over here. And if you look at provincial New Zealand, this government has been sucking money out of the provinces from the day that they entered government. And look at the issue of local roads. The government has cut funding for local roads in provincial New Zealand so that they could fund their uneconomic roads of national significance in Auckland. And that money has to come from somewhere. So provincial councils around New Zealand have had to turn to taxpayers to foot that bill and to bridge that funding gap because the national government has withdrawn support from provincial councils. And then they turn around and criticise them for increasing rates in order to fund that. Because it is the core infrastructure of local government that has driven rates increases in New Zealand. It's been a historical underfunding of infrastructure. It's been a historical lack of planning for infrastructure needs, having a large number of people who stand on tickets of no rates increases and then get locked into not actually building the infrastructure that is required. John Key, when he was Leader of the Opposition, said local government needs to come to the party and start funding infrastructure properly. Business New Zealand accused local government of having lazy balance sheets and said they needed to invest more in infrastructure because their debt levels were low enough that it was prudent to do so. And then suddenly, overnight, we have a 180 flip where suddenly their debt levels are out of control. Suddenly they're being criticised for doing exactly what the national government asked them to do, which is properly fund infrastructure, because without it we are not going to have the regional economic development that is going to lead to economic development nationwide that we need in this country. And then at the same time they pull out what financial support was there from central government to help local government achieve that. That's driven a rates increase, which this government then turns around and blames local government for. The blame should not be with local government. The blame should very firmly be with this government, which has taken away from councils with one hand and then blamed them for having to find that money elsewhere. And that's the reality of the situation. So the Honourable Dr Nick Smith and whoever the current local government minister is, we're not really sure, but it's not going to be for long because the Honourable Dr Nick Smith is going to be back in the helm before too long. The Honourable Dr Nick Smith needs to think very carefully about what he is doing to communities right around the country, because this is a solution looking for a problem. But it is a solution that is going to absolutely gut local government in this country. Absolutely gut local government. It is going to remove local democracy. It is going to mean that when Nick Smith is back in charge as Minister of Local Government, he is going to have extraordinary powers. See, they had to pass legislation in this House to stop Environment Canterbury having elections. They don't want to have to do that for every other council that they're going to stop elections for. So by giving himself a nice, tidy little power in this legislation, Dr Nick Smith doesn't have to come to the House and speak to the voters of New Zealand and the voters whose rights to a democratically elected council he will be removing, because that will happen. He will be able to do it in regulation.
Call Tracy Martin.
Mr Chair, thank you. I rise to take a call on the Local Government Act 2002 Amendment Bill.